Brain Talk Part 2. This is part 2 of our series on menopause and the brain. Welcome, everybody. This is Nathalie Bonafé, and my guest is Dr. Rice. In our first talk, Dr. Rice described to us how estrogen works in the brain and how it does many important things to keep our brains healthy. In this section, we are going to build on this and discuss how the loss of estrogen at the time of perimenopause and menopause affects our brain function and leads to symptoms. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the typical symptoms that go along with perimenopause and menopause. The number one symptoms being hot flashes and night sweats. But do you have a good understanding why these occur? What may surprise you is that it is our brains that are to blame for this. By the end of this session, you will understand why we get hot flashes and also learn how the loss of estrogen leads to some of the other very troubling symptoms associated with perimenopause and menopause, such as mood swings and brain fog. But before we dive into symptoms and what causes them, Dr. Rice is going to briefly review what we discussed in our last session regarding the beneficial effects of estrogen on brain health. Dr. Rice, thanks again for coming today.
Oh, thank you for inviting me. I'm going to pull up my first slide, if I may. And here we go, share. So on our last talk, we did talk about more of the physiology of how estrogen affects the brain, but just in the way of review, this slide shows the beneficial effects that estrogen has in the brain. I don't think a lot of women really realize that our brains really depend on estrogen, both to keep the brain cells healthy and to help protect it from further injury and to help it function well. So the first benefit of estrogen that I want to discuss is that it promotes neural connections. This is what we call neuroplasticity, in that it's important for the nerve cells to constantly be reaching out and connecting with each other. That's how we learn and recall things. Estrogen is also very, very important to help fuel our brain cells. Brain cells need glucose, and estrogen is very, very important as a factor to get the glucose into the cells. We also know that estrogen helps make the chemical messengers that our nerve cells use to communicate with each other. Those are called neurotransmitters. Estrogen is also a very powerful antioxidant and anti-inflammatory agent. And these properties help protect the brain from damage and also help facilitate healing if it is damaged. And finally, estrogen does improve blood flow to the brain. The brain cells constantly need a supply of glucose and oxygen to function, and a good circulation system promotes that. But in addition, the brain cells actually produce waste products. And these particular waste products need to be removed, and you need to have good circulation for that. Some of these waste products you may have heard are amyloid and tau, which are the toxic products that can lead to Alzheimer's.
Yeah, so really the important thing for women to realize is that estrogen isn't just a hormone that makes our female characteristics and organs, but it has important functions in other areas of the body, especially the brain.
Right, and that's the message that we're trying to convey, Natalie, is that the estrogens just aren't all about, menstrual cycles and pregnancy. Estrogen is critical for just about every organ in our body. It's important for our bones, our muscles, our heart, and our brain, and that's what we want to talk about today. And the reason that I think it's really important to emphasize all the properties that estrogen has in our body is that when it comes time for menopause, the cells that were depending on estrogen may not function as well. And women just need to understand that when estrogen goes away, there's lots of things that can happen that they may not really be aware of.
Yes, and that's what we want to discuss today. What happens to our brain function? Because we function, we specifically talking about the brain. What happens to our brain function when the estrogen level goes down? We really are learning more about why women get symptoms during perimenopause and menopause. And I think it's fascinating that many of these symptoms are actually coming from the brain.
That's so true. And what we're going to try to do is help women understand why this happens. The brain really is the mastermind behind a lot of the symptoms that women experience. So let's dive in and look at a slide of the brain. This is a half cut through the brain that shows some areas that I've highlighted in color. And these are areas where there are a very high concentration of what we call estrogen receptors. And the significance of this is that if there are a lot of estrogen receptors, that means that these areas of the brain are very, very dependent on estrogen. So that during menopause and perimenopause, we start getting symptoms. And a lot of it is due because the estrogen isn't allowing these cells to function optimally.
So just to make sure those listening understand the difference between perimenopause and menopause, can we review that quickly?
Yeah, because I think there's some confusion about that. Menopause is the point in time when our ovaries quit making estrogen, basically. There's no more eggs, so there's no more ovulation, but there's no more estrogen production. But this doesn't just happen overnight. There's a period of time where the ovaries are winding down slowly in their ability to function. And this period of time that's called the perimenopause. And the perimenopause, during that period, we don't ovulate consistently, so the menstrual cycles are erratic. But during that time, we also have quite a few symptoms. And the point to make is that this can last anywhere from a few years to even 10 years.
Yeah. I think a lot of women don't realize this, and there are a lot of times when a woman in early 40s or even earlier may start having symptoms and not realize these are actually due to these hormone changes. It happens to me all the time when I bring up the subject, because I'm older, mid-50s. When I bring up the subject to a younger woman, it's they crunch and just say, oh, how come it could be menopause and perimenopause? And it's really a problem. So we're trying to bring awareness.
Yeah. I mean, and so the average age of menopause is between 45 and 55. And if your perimenopause is, 8 or 9 years, I mean, you could start having symptoms in your late 30s, and women start feeling that way and they go to the doctor, and, it's not even on the radar that this could be perimenopause.
And it could be fixed earlier. But
exactly.
We'll talk about that later. Yeah.
Some attention. Exactly. So, and I think the point that I want to try to emphasize that maybe a lot of women aren't aware is that the symptoms that we attribute to menopause are not just because the estrogen level is low. It's also because the estrogen level is changing. And this really affects our brain a lot, because the brain just does not like the hormone levels to fluctuate. And I have a slide here that I think helps maybe bring this home. In this slide, we have the estrogen level on the side, and then we have the phases of our life. And starting in childhood, the estrogen level is low, right? And then puberty, that's when our hormone levels start ramping up and they start increasing. Then we go through this period from about age 16 to 40, 45. We call that the reproductive years. That's when we're ovulating regularly. Our estrogen levels are actually, you can see, at their peak here. And then the next phase is the perimenopause. And you can see the levels going down, but it's not going down in a nice linear fashion. It's bouncing up and down. And then the final phase here is the point where the estrogen level, again, is very, very low, and it stays low. And it's this up and down business that can really start causing symptoms. So women in this period are experiencing a lot of symptoms, and we're going to talk more about those symptoms as we go through.
Dr. Rice, we had discussed, we were teenagers at some point, and there are lots of women in the menopause years that have children of their own as teenagers. And so puberty is a perfect example of fluctuation. I don't think we want to start talking about, how difficult it is to raise teenagers, to deal with teenagers. I bow to those women. So there are lots of changes there. So we remember these erratic times, but also during our periods, during the during our own cycles, when we have, this changing in hormones, we also experience regular monthly, most of us, all of us, a lot of us, some changes in mood and in sensitivity and in duration. Some women. You want to just say a couple of words about that?
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly true. Is that during the reproductive years, just even, they're not dramatic changes in the hormone levels. They go up and down, but throughout the month, there's definitely big changes in our hormone levels, and that affects the brain. That leads to, I mean, at one point in the month, you're one person, and the next point month, you're a totally different person, and a lot of women don't even understand why that's happening.
Yeah, and we just need to know more about, and I think emphasizing the fluctuation in the perimenopause years is really just adding to what we know about puberty and menstruation during the year. So the more we talk about those fluctuations, the better we'll be able to advocate for ourselves. So the message is that we want to make the message that we want to make is that when our estrogen is fluctuating, this can lead to symptoms. This can happen even during our reproductive years, during the monthly menstrual cycle. We just said women can feel differently depending on the time of the month, and this is what can cause PMS symptoms. Also, women get more migraine headaches before their menstrual period. So
that's
all linked. This is all linked.
Excellent point, Ellie. It's again just to expand on that, migraine headaches. Women in the perimenopause here, it can be terrible. They can have much more frequent migraines, more severe migraines, and again, it's that fluctuating estrogen levels that the brain doesn't like. There's no question. That's a good point. So let's move on now that it's important to people realize that we're talking not only about low estrogen, but fluctuating estrogen. Let's look in the areas of the brain that are affected by these hormonal changes. So the green area here, let's start with that. That's the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus does a lot of stuff, and we'll be talking about some of those issues here as we proceed. But one area that the hypothalamus is in charge of is our reproduction and menstrual cycle. So it would make sense that estrogen plays a huge role here in the hypothalamus. So we have a lot of estrogen receptors here because there's this ongoing dialogue between the hypothalamus and the ovaries. And I'll demonstrate this here to get into a little bit of physiology, my favorite stuff. So here we have the brain with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus sends messengers down to the pituitary gland, chemical hormones, and it tells the pituitary to make two hormones. They're called FSH and LH, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. And these hormones go down to the ovary, and they instruct the ovary to get an egg ready to mature and then be released, and then we have ovulation. In addition, though, the FSH and LH are stimulating the ovary to make estrogen. So then we have estrogen being produced, and it goes out into the circulation. It makes its way up to the brain and the hypothalamic area here, and the hypothalamic area is monitoring it. And if a woman's ovulated and if a woman gets pregnant, then she has a lot of estrogen. So the hypothalamus says, oh, there's no point in stimulating another egg. We've already got, that
feedback, yeah,
that going. So the pituitary then quits making FSH and LH. And it happens during your monthly cycle. And throughout your monthly cycle, the estrogen and the FSH and LH are going up and down, preparing for the monthly ovulation. Now, what happens in menopause? Well, we really don't know why the ovary quits working. It just kind of runs out of eggs and quits working around age 50. Average age of menopause is 52. But basically, the ovary quits working. We don't have any more eggs, so there's no further ovulation. And furthermore, we don't have any estrogen, so there's no estrogen. So the hypothalamus is monitoring this and go, hey, there's no estrogen coming here. We better try to get those ovaries to work. So it, continues to produce FSH and LH.
Mm-hmm. So for women who are in menopause and have blood tests done, high FSH, correct?
Yep,
and
yep.
Is that what causes the hot flashes?
No, that's an excellent question. The FSH, the hallmark of menopause, if you do blood tests, would be a low estrogen and a high FSH. Sometimes that's used to diagnose menopause. In fact, in women who, don't have they've had a hysterectomy and they, don't know what's going on with their menstrual cycle. But the FSH per se doesn't appear to be what's causing the hot flashes. And it's basically the low estrogen. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. But let me digress a little bit, because this is kind of some interesting sort of cutting edge stuff about FSH, is that we didn't used to think that FSH had much to do with menopause. We just thought, well, it's just more of a marker, to find out if you were in menopause. But there's some pretty interesting research that's showing that there seems to be a correlation with high FSH levels and osteoporosis. So it's not just the low estrogen that's starting to make our bones thin. It may actually be that extra FSH circulating around. And the other thing, what I find is really fascinating, the research in fat metabolism, is that fat cells also seem to be very sensitive to FSH. So we start seeing high levels of FSH in the perimenopause. And actually, let me just go back here a second. This is something I didn't really mention. So as we get into perimenopause, the estrogen levels go down, but the FSH is actually pretty high in here, because the FSH is trying to get those darn ovaries to work. So we actually, in perimenopause, have pretty high FSH levels, despite the low estrogen. So that's what's kind of interesting here, is that what are two of the other issues in perimenopause that we're not directly addressing today, but women start losing bone even before menopause. They can lose a lot of bone before menopause, and they also start putting on that belly fat. That's a perimenopausal issue. So, it could be that maybe it's the FSH that's the culprit. So this is really interesting.
It's fascinating.
It
is
is
fascinating.
Yeah, and why has it taken so long to figure it out? But that's another.
Well, we've discussed this in a previous talk. We were not supposed to live that long. I mean, 1900. In 1900. I mean, it's really the 20th century, and a little bit. I mean, past 20 years in the 21st century. But we need more research. We need more research. We won't say it more, but it's there is research, but I believe, you're the physician, but I believe it's not going, to be implemented in women's health until we have enough research that, FSH is going to increase osteoporosis. So yes, our primary care physicians tell us to get some calcium and vitamin D, but take some calcium and vitamin D until we really understand why.
Right. Yes, it's kind
of
get
the hammer and really start preventing this.
Yeah. So
what causes the hot flashes?
Good point. Yeah. What causes the hot flashes? So it clearly has something to do with the low estrogen. And once again, we're getting back to our hypothalamic area, the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus also is the area that helps regulate our temperature. So, and let me just digress a teeny bit and explain this. How do we regulate temperature? Well, throughout our body, we have little thermostats in our core that are monitoring our core temperature, and they're constantly sending signals up to the hypothalamus, to say, here we are, we're a little on the cold side, we're a little on the warm side. If we're cold, the hypothalamus sends out signals back down to the body to do various things. It sends signals down to the circulatory system to constrict our blood vessels. That's why your nose and your hands get blue, because there's no blood going down there, because the body's trying to keep that heat, within our core. It also sends signals to the muscles to shiver. It's like when you're rubbing your hands and creating heat, the shivering actually generates heat. Conversely, if the body temperature, the core temperature gets a little bit too high, the hypothalamus is going to send signals again down to our body, to our, to cool us off. And so basically in a hot flash, the body temperature goes up and the hypothalamus sends signals down to cool it off.
So many women don't realize that the hot flash they feel is the body trying to cool off.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah, and we got flushed because the blood vessels dilate near the surface of the skin, and when we sweat, like in the night sweat, the sweat evaporates, which is another way the body tries to cool off.
Yeah, that's interesting. Apparently, it's just a tiny change in body temperature that can trigger a hot flash, which is pretty fascinating. And what we think is going on is that with low estrogen, for some reason, the thermostat in the hypothalamus gets overly sensitive. So a tiny change in temperature will trigger this hot flash and sweating. So it's actually inappropriately that it does it, which can make women very uncomfortable. So the issue is that it's it gets back to, it's not merely maybe the low estrogen, but it's that bouncing up and down estrogen that makes that thermostat get overly sensitive and send down these signals. So let me just kind of review some sort of cutting edge understanding about hot flashes, which again, I think is really, really interesting. We used to think that it all had something to do with this half of this diagram, that it had something to do with, well, the low estrogens did something relating to the FSH and LH, and there's no ovulation, so there's hot flashes. It was kind of a black box. We didn't really understand what actually caused the hot flashes. But interestingly, we've discovered a whole new area in the hypothalamus that actually is the kind of the center for the hot flashes. And again, I don't want to put out too much information that's too technical, but instead of going directly to the areas that monitor the menstrual cycles, there's another area in the hypothalamus that the low estrogen is actually being monitored up here. And then this area of the hypothalamus sends down messages to the thermoregulation center that we were just talking about, and it releases some other chemicals that actually cause the hot flash. And so it's pretty fascinating that we've got this kind of accessory pathway here that's causing the hot flash, which doesn't seem to have really anything to do with the with menstrual cycles, right?
Well, by your slide, these two areas also are somehow connected.
Right.
They're so close in the hypothalamus. But why would that be? I mean,
That's
I
yeah,
would just be.
that's I mean that's what's really been interesting. And this is
It's
again,
fascinating.
yeah, this is relatively new, kind of a new understanding. And
But it makes sense at the same time
yeah,
because
yeah, and
there's
actually, if
always a reason behind this.
there's always a reason, right?
In biology, everything is perfectly programmed. So
Well,
logical.
if you knew all the answers, it would be great. But you're right, Natalie, that they're evolutionarily speaking, the fact that these two areas are so close and connected, that it obviously, but the theory is that it has something to do with how important it was over the centuries to be sure that our body temperature was closely monitoring the status of our reproductive cycle, so that if when an egg is released and the conditions have to be such for, in the uterus or whatever the primitive organs were, to be sure that the ovulation was successful, and then the subsequent, fetus, or,
It's really about survival when you think of it. It's
right.
about
Yeah. When
survival of the species.
exactly. Yeah. I mean, you can't, there's no point in trying to procreate, or reproduce if the conditions aren't right. So it's pretty interesting. And again, this is a lot of technical, and I know you and I find it interesting, and I hope our listeners do too. But one of the reasons that I wanted to put this in is because I think women are going to be, hearing more about, some maybe new drugs that are involving this area. So more to come on that.
Yeah, it could be very useful. So where are we? So it's hard to study hot flashes in the lab. Like, how do we tell that a mouse is having hot flash?
Right.
And the same.
I guess they measure their tail warmth. I'm not sure.
Yeah, their tail is actually very interesting, but that's another topic. And the same goes true for studying many of the other symptoms associated with perimenopause and menopause, which have a lot to do with our mood, such as mood changes and depression. Do we understand why changes in the estrogen level would cause those?
Yeah, I think we have a little better understanding of that. And let me go back to our slide. One area to point out is that, again, the hypothalamus, another area in here that's affected by estrogen is our sleep pattern and circadian, cycle is all being governed in this area. So probably the low estrogens are affecting that. It's very, very common for, women to have sleep problems during the perimenopause and early menopause. And that, of course, is definitely going to affect a person's mood. Depression is highly correlated with poor sleep. But more importantly, well, not more importantly, but equally importantly, this other area here in the brainstem area is the main source of our serotonin production. And serotonin is one of those neurotransmitters that really have a huge role in our mood. Low serotonin levels are associated with depression, with anxiety, with a lot of those mood disorders. And we know that, there's been quite a bit of research in this area, that estrogen is very important, not only to have these brain cells produce serotonin, but to actually keep the serotonin from getting broken down.
So the drugs used for depression are called SSRI, correct? And they are designed to raise serotonin levels.
Right.
Does estrogen help as well?
Yeah, that's a good question. Certainly estrogen helps women sleep. It definitely helps those night sweats and the sleep issues. And that clearly is going to help depression. But there's also, certainly in experimental animals, estrogen has been shown to increase serotonin levels in the brain. So, and as far as studies in people, there definitely has been studies that show that taking estrogen, especially with a serotonin drug, can really help major depression. So that is something that has, even though I have to say that it's not, estrogen per se is not approved, as antidepressant treatment. But certainly if a woman's having hot flashes, it's going to help.
Yeah. So let's talk about another symptom common in perimenopause, and that's brain fog.
Yeah, here's my brain fog slide. That's very common. It's not a medical diagnosis, brain fog, but it's clearly something I think almost everybody in perimenopause can relate to. It's just kind of having trouble with memory, having trouble focusing, just not able to multitask, not able to function. Sometimes it can be mild, but sometimes it can be pretty darn severe.
Yeah.
Yeah, and probably don't need to describe in more detail, but it is definitely.
Well, people who've gone through it, it's more or less severe. And in our last little series, we'll talk about how to, we can do things to help with that.
Exactly.
Naturally, but it is real. It is a sense of disconnection, and although the name doesn't really sound like a diagnosis, it is real, and we're here to talk that it is real.
And then, not surprisingly, getting back to our slide about where estrogen receptors, where estrogen plays a huge role, is in a number of areas that are involved in cognition and the sort of issues that would cause brain fog. And that's the hippocampus. The hippocampus is really an important area for processing new information and memory and learning. The thalamus is kind of a central area that receives all the input from our senses and processes them and sends them to other parts of the brain. And then the prefrontal cortex is part of our big cerebrum, our big cerebral area. And the prefrontal cortex has a lot to do with more complicated learning, attention, association, problem solving. So once again, the point that we're trying to make is that as the estrogen level falls and also as it changes, the cells in all these areas they're just not firing as well. They're just not functioning as well. It's bound to affect how people behave.
Yeah, making associations. I mean, we do that, especially in this modern world. This is so important to brain functioning. Everybody is doing a lot. It's a lot too much, maybe, but it gets even more challenging when we go into that perimenopause, and also our social interactions. It's not just our intellect; it's just how we this association and learning and memories. I mean, this is all connected.
Exactly.
So unfortunately, all of those things, unfortunately, do get worse with age. It's proven. We know that. I mean, I work with the elderly people, so why do we think it's the loss of estrogen rather than aging alone causing these problems?
Exactly, yeah. And again, these are hard things to study, and there have been studies, in animals where they've, taken away their estrogen and they find they can't get through the maze as well, even if they're young. But they've, also been doing some, a lot of tests, cognitive tests on women who go through menopause and comparing them to, women who haven't gone through menopause. So this is just a slide that kind of just makes it just a general representation of what I'm trying to say is that you can certainly have 45 women who's premenopausal, someone who won't go into menopause for another 10 years, she's premenopausal. And then you could take a 45 women who is in perimenopause, who is on the verge of menopause, and they've done tests, on same age women, and they find pretty consistent, not consistently, but consistently enough that women who are going through perimenopause don't score as high as the women who are premenopausal. So there's been a number of studies along those lines that have suggested that it is the the perimenopause and presumably the lack of estrogens that are affecting their cognition. But I think even more interesting is some of these other studies that are being done now on actual brain, brain imaging studies that check brain function. And this slide I took from Dr. Lisa Mosconi, who I think you're familiar with, Natalie.
Oh yeah, she's the one who started me. Like when I saw this picture, when I saw this article, that started me on the whole menopause and women's health.
Is that right? Yeah, yeah.
This is what really started me, because I was focusing on the elderly and people at the end of life. And that was a switch to me. That's what allowed me to make the connection.
Interesting. Yeah, yeah. She's really done, really been a good spokeswoman in the cutting edge, looking at perimenopause and menopause and the woman's brain. And
in the brain, yeah, and the effect on nutrition. But we'll get on this later. But
exactly.
This is, yes, the level of energy in the brain, in the different areas of the brain.
Yeah, it's fascinating. So just to kind of, this is kind of, I can simplistically kind of review the slide. So this is a special, it's called a PET scan. It's a little different than, X-ray or MRI in that it is measuring the brain's activity, how active the brain is working, meaning it's, talking to its adjoining cells and associating and, all, just everything that makes our brains more functional. And so the red here indicates there's a lot of brain activity. And it basically, they measure this by, how fast the brain cells are taking up glucose. Because, if you're really working hard and taking up glucose, you're able, demonstrating that you're functioning really, really optimally. So you can see now these both women could both be the same age. So let's say we have, again, our 45-year-old woman here and our 45-year-old woman here. Maybe this woman had her ovaries taken out and she went through menopause early. But what we have is a lot of red activity, especially in that prefrontal area and in deeper areas, a lot of red activity. And this same woman doing the same activity, whatever they had them doing, perhaps trying to do a puzzle or something, her brain activity, the red is really significantly diminished. So you can see the difference, right? So that just indicates that this particular woman, who they could be very much, they could be the same age, right? Her brain activity is not as active. So, it's studies like this that are really opening our eyes to, there is.
This was a breakthrough. Yeah, this was a breakthrough, in my opinion.
Yeah.
But, when we talk about activity, it's really, firing of the neurons. It's about energy, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's physics, right? It's energy, and who says energy in the body? Who says muscles? We talk about in the brain, in the body. We say energy in the muscles. Eat your pasta before going to the gym. But in the case of the brain, we're talking about glucose uptake, which you mentioned. Estrogen was crucial to having this uptake by the neurons.
Exactly.
So this is great. So when these brain scans do show that our brain simply is not working as well, that actually helps validate women who complain about these symptoms and know they're not, crazy, know they're not being dramatic. It's actually a physiological thing that is happening. And this really is something going on. There is really something going on. And what we've been telling us is it would seem like it is the loss of estrogen that is causing the problem. So Dr. Rice, does taking estrogen help? And so does estrogen help the brain fog?
Yeah, that's
$1 million question.
yeah, that is the $1 million question. I mean, anecdotally, and from my personal experience, definitely yes. And and there a number of studies, like I showed in the cognition studies, do show that women on estrogen do better. But the question is, is the estrogen actually making the brain function better, or is the estrogen just making the women feel better, that they're sleeping better, their cognition improves because they're sleeping better and they're not having as many hot flashes and those other things in their life are better. But we don't have the large scale studies to really study can we say estrogen is going to help your brain. But let me just say that we know that women who have gone through menopause early, those women that have had their ovaries removed for some surgical reason, that go through early menopause, if they aren't on estrogen, they clearly don't have their cognitive function is very diminished, and in fact they're actually at higher risk for dementia. This is an area that's being looked at real closely right now, and we're going to talk about more. But the issue is that as we're going through perimenopause and our brains aren't getting the estrogen, are they actually having to work harder? Are they actually having to go recruit more brain cells to function? And is this actually kind of jump-starting them into long-term dementia, cognitive decline? That's the million-dollar question right now, whether or not estrogen therapy helps that. And we're going to be addressing that.
That's why we need more research.
Exactly. Yes. So yeah, I think that'll be kind of the carrot for people to tune into our next show.
Yeah, so this is so important, and it will be the focus of our next 2 sessions. We will be talking more about estrogen and dementia, Alzheimer's disease, and then what can women do to help minimize not only their symptoms during the perimenopause, but what they can do to help prevent overstressing their brains during this time, to perhaps improve their future brain health. And we don't know if estrogen is the answer, but there are other things that may help. So stay tuned. Dr. Rice, it's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me on.
Thank you very much. See you soon.
Bye.